Um, and originally this was going to be just about our super ensemble climate modeling effort, which he'll say a little bit about. It's a systematic exploration of uncertainties in initial conditions and physical parameters. But he also looked at two other regional modeling frameworks. So you saw in the last talk an example of global model output statistically downscaled. This is what it looks like before you downscale it. This is the pattern of change in temperature averaged over a whole bunch of GCMs. And the point here is that you can't see any evidence there that they're topographic features other than a big sort of bump in Montana, which represents the Rocky Mountains. And so really, we want to use regional models. Cliff's a big advocate of that. I'm a big advocate of that. But often regional modeling runs are done once. And so you might have a 10-year simulation in the past and a 10-year simulation in the future, and a statistician would say, any differences are unlikely to be significant. So this is an example of a map from a paper showing changes in precipitation in June, July, August. They were actually perturbing some vegetation parameters. And so you see all these splotchy differences, and how much of that is real and how much of it is just statistical noise. So if we're going to use regional models, we want to use a really large number of regional models to get better signal-to-noise ratio. And so really this is the trade-off. The CMIP5 models indicated by the circles give us, and so over there on the left is the log number of, I think that's, yeah, log number of runs. So some of them only have one run, some of them have dozens, but the spatial resolution isn't good enough. So a lot of typical regional modeling results are those circles down in the lower left, where there's one simulation, and it may be very high resolution, but you don't have good signal to noise. So the regionalclimateprediction.net effort, 140,000 simulations, so we get high spatial resolution and also very high number of runs to improve the signal to noise. But it is just one model, even with all the physical parameter perturbations. And so really what we want to do is look beyond that. One cool thing you can do, though, with this very large ensemble is look at extremes, and not just at things like an extreme distribution, but you can actually quantify the uncertainties around that estimation instead of just plotting it and fitting a generalized extreme value fit. So there are really cool things with the super ensemble, but the main point of this talk, I'll hand it over now to Christian, is really what patterns are robust when we look at regional models.
All right, hello. I am Christian McGillen, meteorology undergrad from Virginia Tech. And as Phil described, I spent my summer, 2 months of my summer at the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. And I was looking at dynamically downscaled high resolution regional climate models. I looked at 3 in particular, the REG-CPDN, which is a super ensemble, the REG-CLIM, which is produced by the USGS, and NARCAP, which is the North American Regional Climate Change Assessment Program, which is out of UCAR. And so my research questions that I looked at are robust patterns of climate change observed across regional climate models. Can we see a confluence with what these models are showing us, and what physical processes explain identified robust patterns? And then lastly, what might account for differences among these models? So my methods, I focused on 4 primary fundamental variables: Tmax, max temperature, minimum temperature, total precipitation, and then snow water equivalent SWE. All data was monthly data that I used, and I focused primarily on the Pacific Northwest domain, but most of it involved the entire West Coast. The spatial domain was different across most of the models. In fact, all 3 models were different, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And then I looked at seasonal means. I was looking at future minus past seasonal means. So, as I described briefly, I focused on 3 regional climate model experiments: NARCAP, REG-CPDN, and then the REG-CLIM. So they had varying resolutions. NARCAP was the lowest resolution at 50 kilometers for each grid cell. and it combined 10 GCM and RCM pairings, unique pairings. And the years that I looked at for my future from NARCAP was 2038 to 2069, and then 1968 to 1999 for the past. And then Reg CPDN, which is the Super Ensemble, is a 25-kilometer resolution, so we're doubling the resolution. And it is just one pairing. However, it has hundreds of thousands of runs. And I used 2029 to 2049 and 1985 to 2005. And then lastly, RegClim, which is a 15-kilometer resolution, so our highest resolution that we're looking at. And it combines 3 unique GCM and RCM pairings. And it is 2039, 2069, and then 1969 to 1999. So now looking at some figures, this is the first one from NARCAP, and this is a look at the change in max temperature for spring. I used March, April, and May for spring, and we're starting to look at laser pointer. Okay. So we're starting to look for spatial patterns here, and one that's immediately identifiable is Sierra Nevadas. We can see that as we go up the Sierra Nevadas, we're seeing an increase in change in temperature, and that's accompanied by this scatter plot here. We're not really picking up anything from the Coast Range or the Cascades. For this resolution, it kind of smooths over at 50 kilometers. It's not quite as fine as the other two. So moving over to the scatter plot, what I'm looking at is change in max temp plotted against the elevation in meters. And we can see a pretty clear increase as you go up in elevation with increase in change in max temperature. And this is something that was observed across all 3 models as we'll see. Another thing to note out of this scatter plot is where the max elevation is. It's a bit below 2,500 meters. And each point on that scatter plot represents a grid cell or a grid data point from the model. And due to the resolution, we have less data points for this scatter plot. So now on to the Reg CPDN, which is doubling that resolution. So we can see a larger amount of data points. We're into the tens of thousands for data points now. And then once again, picking up the Sierra Nevadas, we see our largest change in seasonal temperature there. Along now, we're picking up Cascades and a little bit of the Coast Range. Also, one thing to note is the coastal gradient in temperature, mostly in California, right here. It's much steeper south. Once you go north, you lose that steep gradient. And then also note where the max elevation is now, closer to 3,000 meters. Now onto RegClim, the highest resolution. Once again, Sierra Nevadas are being picked up well. We're getting a large amount of data points. This is upwards of 20,000 data points. And then note the max elevation. And we can once again see that as we increase in elevation, increase in the change in max temperature. So now a quick look at all 3 together. One thing that I later did but was not able to include in this PowerPoint is break it down into regions, because this is there's a lot of points to look at here and here. And so broke them down into Washington, Oregon, and California, so you could get a clearer picture of what's happening in each state and each region. Now this is a terrain elevation 3D model with the change in temperature mapped on top of it. So this is just to give a different perspective, a new view, and you can now see where the highest change in temperature is on the tops of these elevation peaks. And just note how smooth this is for NARCAP, which is the, once again, 50-kilometer resolution. Once we double it, we really start to pick up all of the regional features. We have Cascades, coast, obviously Sierras, and once again, the highest changes in temperature you can see on tops of those peaks. And then the highest resolution model, the RegClim at 15 kilometers. So now some precipitation. Precipitation Percent difference for spring, this is total precipitation, and we were looking at leeward-windward relationships in precipitation. So you can see a decrease on the leeward side this is Reg-Clim, for the Reg-Clim model on the Sierras. This is NARCAP, so we're losing that resolution, but we're still picking up a decrease. However, it's on the windward side, and we're picking up a bit of an increase on the leeward side. And now for the Reg-C-PDN, picking up a decrease on the windward side and an even greater decrease on the leeward side of the Sierras. And these are to be taken with a grain of salt. Now for winter, it's not as pronounced of a relationship. Once again, though, decrease on the leeward side. And for NARCAP, we can see the peaks here with not much change. However, increases on both sides. So the most robust pattern that we observed was the influence of elevation on your temperature in spring. As I showed with those 3D models and the scatter plots, there's a pretty clear trend that as you increase in elevation, we're going to see greater changes in your temperature for spring. And then looking at those precip plots, we're seeing the leeward-windward relationship. However, the degree as well as the sign, whether it was increase on leeward or windward, changed, as well as location changed across the models. However, there was definitely some physical process that was being picked up and we could observe. But definitely, so be very cautious when interpreting a single model simulation. If you had just looked at one of those, you would not have been able, for precipitation, for example, you could be misled. You wouldn't necessarily be getting the full picture. And the confluence from the models helps improve the confidence in the results. So, any questions? What's that?
Repeat the question. We have time for one question.
No question?
When you're measuring the differences, you're measuring percentage difference, which seems to me to be a formula for making it look like there are larger changes in some areas, particularly say in precipitation, in the dry areas and allowing the wetter areas. So could you talk about the advantages and disadvantages of those?
So the question was the observed use of percentage difference versus absolute for looking at our differences. And the percent difference was just for precipitation. The temperature was just absolute. It was mean degrees or max degrees for the month. And we used percent difference, I believe, just because you're going to have rainfall is not going to be uniform, or total precipitation is not going to be uniform for all parts. So in order to understand how much, so if you get an area that gets less precipitation, and bumbling on this, you want to?
I mean, across the West, there are some locations that get, 200 inches of rain a year and some that get, 5. And so if you plot the change in absolute precipitation, it looks a lot like the mean, which is interesting. But basically all you see is what happens in the wettest locations. So we climate scientists often plot the percent change, because then we can look across the whole West and look at different kinds of contrast. So we'll often look at both, but there's less to be learned from changes in absolutes.
Any other?
So I think that question is really pursuant to David's talk. Yeah, we have a paper published a year ago that has a table listing the performance of these different models. So there are 20 available. Some people want to run terrible models as well as good models, but we do provide the guidance as well to say, we recommend starting at the top and running the top 10 or so. Yeah, but here, the Hadley model that we used for CPDN, it's their regional model embedded in their global atmospheric model, which is one of the best performers. And we didn't actually look that closely at the ones used in the NARCAP or RegClone.